Uganda's economy is one of the fastest growing in the world, but many Ugandans do not think so, or at least do not feel it. And rightly so, because this development is only felt by a few individuals. Now, my name is Simon Kasiate, and in today's episode of Turning Round Uganda, we look at Uganda's development potential and which sectors can spread this development across the board.
This is Turning Round Uganda, the alternative policy series. Coming up on the program.
In this country, the only time we talk about value chains is when you are talking about a certain donor to come and work on it.
You cannot throw money at poverty.
If you ask me, we have a headache of these expenditures.
It's ridiculous, I will say it again, for any nation to be indebted on a platform of consumption.
Winston Churchill dubbed Uganda the Pearl of Africa. With its dense misty forests, the majestic mountains of the moon, glassy lakes and sprawling savannas, the title was befitting.
This country has a lot of opportunities, including but not limited to tourism opportunities, mining, great mining potential. We have abundant labor force. We have agriculture as a great potential opportunity for us, resources such as oil and gas. But what we need to do is, as a country, is to strengthen the fundamentals, the basics that are required to exploit these opportunities.
At independence, unlike neighboring Tanzania, Uganda enjoyed rich natural resources, a flourishing economy, and an impressive number of educated and prosperous middle-class African professionals such as doctors, lawyers, and teachers.
In sub-Saharan Africa, we were pioneers of liberalization and pro-market policies in the 1980s, which established the foundation for the country's remarkable economic performance in the 1990s and 2000s. During this period, we diversified our exports, mainly through fisheries and tourism, with high levels of private investment. Exports of agricultural commodities grew by 16% per annum, as has been mentioned earlier, during most of the 2000s. Private investment, which increased to an average of 18% of GDP at the end of the century, was mostly driven by construction. These impressive achievements were underpinned by strong political commitment that propelled strong policy reforms.
She was a model of stability and progress. In fact, Uganda was compared better than some Asian economies like Taiwan, Bangladesh, and Malaysia. Today, these Asian tigers are on their way to becoming first world countries, and Uganda still a third world. Question is, what went wrong for Uganda?
The Uganda economy, as you may recall, opted for a different strategy, different policies, socialist policies. At the time of independence, Uganda started off as a mixed economy. But by 1969, the state had taken a bigger role in the economy through nationalization program. And that didn't take place in Malaysia. The Malaysia economy was a market economy with a clear role of the state in terms of supporting private sector-led growth. And that was very, very different. Uganda embarked on such a strategy only recently, about around 1990.
This is Jinja. Jinja, the once industrial town of Uganda, is a ghost of its former self. What is left is a broken road network in the once vibrant industrial capital of Uganda, as well as concrete shells of walls that used to house numerous factories and workers who came from different parts of the country to earn a living in the country's industrial capital. All the buzz of activity that used to be has been replaced by inactivity, and what's left is the legacy of the now defunct factories. Reviving these industries would ensure jobs for several thousand jobless Ugandans and also boost our export capacity.
Our industrial policy must be based on local potential, meaning that industries that are based on production that can be supplied from local inputs. These could include agro-processing industries. It could include industries that use our mineral potential, like cement production. We have a lot of depots of limestone in Karamoja. Or industries, so based on local potential. Look at the potential and then, or the opportunity, and then try to create an industry around that.
Uganda may not be a first world country, but she has definitely made significant strides in development that cannot be underestimated.
For the last 25 years under NRM, Uganda's per capita income has been growing at around 3% per year, double that of the US. So by any global standard, except for China, where per capita income growth is about 7%, except for China and South Korea and Botswana, Uganda is one of the best performers in the world. So scientifically, Museveni would floor anybody who says that he has underperformed on economic growth.
Despite these encouraging signs, today unemployment and underemployment remain particularly persistent. The youth, who make up about 78% of the population, are currently unable to find work. More and more slums are cropping up in the capital city, crime rates are on the increase, inflation constantly fluctuating. These are anything but indicators of economic growth.
Things like production, how much we produce as a country is another important indicator. Things like how much we are able to respond to different shocks is also an indicator. The ability to rise if you have inflation, if you have fluctuations in price, such things. But also things like export, how much you export is also another indicator. And those are the mainstream indicators. But for me, there are things that are important. As a person who works every day on civil society issues, I think things like the standard of living is an important indicator, and we should be thinking about that. And things like the level of health of the people in the country is an important indicator.
Our job market is at one of its most challenging moments. We have got more and more people with labor wishing to be engaged, but they are not getting that opportunity. So from that perspective, we're extremely in a very, very difficult situation. Also, increasingly, the purchasing power of our own people is being challenged. Salaries have remained largely stagnant, but they are being eroded by inflation. And yet the employers are also saying, we can only improve your salary remuneration to the extent the company or the business is growing. So even in terms of the purchasing power, most Ugandans are having a tough time.
The assessment shows that the country has been slowing down, growing at around 5–6%, which is much lower than its potential, which has been estimated to be around 7%. The last financial year, it slowed down to 3.4. This year, it is expected to recover to about 4.3, between 4.3 and 5, according to our assessment. But even that is much slower than what the country should be growing at if it's going to achieve its middle income status prospects.
We'll need growth of at least 10%. And whereas the government projects that at an annual growth of 7% per annum, we should be able to attain middle income status, I discount the 7 with the annual population growth. So if you're growing at annual at 7% and the population is growing at 3 or 3.5, which is the case in Uganda, then the effective growth is actually, about 4 or less than 4%.
Last financial year, economic growth was 3.5%. 3.5, when you have population growth rate of 3.3%, means you have 0% economic growth in the last 1 year. Why was that so? I think the government of Uganda spent a lot of money, plus external shocks, and we had inflation. To control inflation, the central bank intervened to mop excess liquidity out of circulation, and in doing that, they increased interest rates in banks. The private sector stopped borrowing. Private sector borrowing fell from 45% to about 8%. When the private sector is not borrowing, it means they're not investing and they're not employing people, they're not producing goods and services as they were doing, and therefore you have slow growth.
In theory, economic growth is the increase in the amount of goods and services produced by an economy in a specific time frame, normally a year. 13% of Uganda's population lives in the city, while the remaining 77% live in rural Uganda. The biggest percentage of Uganda's population suffering in chronic poverty lives in rural Uganda. Agriculture, which is the biggest employer of that population, only contributes about 15% to the economy.
Precisely because the agriculture that we participate in is very subsistence. It's agriculture where people just eat what they produce. And in any agriculture system, if you eat what you produce, then the best thing, your economic growth can only be seen in terms of how big your stomach is.
Beyond that, I feel you cannot make a living out of agriculture in terms of making it to become your platform for economic prosperity. In Teso, we used to have that feeling that if you have got these big bulls in the corral, you can keep it for 20 years, 25 years, and you have the pride of showing somebody that that bull is as old as my son, who is now at the university. Let me tell you this, by the time a bull is beyond 5 years or 7 years, it has reached its maximum economic return level. Those other additional years, you are just feeding it, treating it, but with no economic returns. Why not sell that bull, get 2 younger ones, which in 2-3 years more, they will all be giving you kilos of meat.
Now, when you look at the government allocation as far as the budget is concerned, what's given to agriculture is fairly small. But in my view, when you think about the demands on the government as far as public expenditure is concerned in terms of infrastructure, you need to spend big money to build Karuma. You need to spend big money to build roads and bridges. You need to spend a lot of money to have power and the rail working. On the other hand, agriculture, you don't need those big ticket items, but it's just interventions like, provisions of high quality seeds and fertilizers and irrigation schemes. And in some cases, all the farmers need is just services as in terms of extension services. So I think that's where the government is sort of missing the point. Even the little money actually they allocate to agriculture, in my view, I think is not delivering the results, because when you look at NADS and NUSAF and rural farmer scheme we had before, plan for modernization of agriculture, there have been so many initiatives, but you still go back to the village and you find people digging with a hoe.
When Turning Around Uganda returns,
you cannot throw money at poverty.
in the name of wiping out poverty, the government of Uganda has put in place many poverty eradication plans and of late money is given to youths in sacks. But these have not delivered the desired growth and poverty reduction intended. Recently, the government of Uganda, in partnership with the FCU Bank, Stanbic and Centenary Bank, made available a venture capital fund of 25 billion Ugandan shillings.
I am always left wondering whether we are really that serious in some of our decisions on certain things. One, you cannot throw money at poverty.
No public initiative of that nature will survive the test of time if it is driven by a sympathy vote, if it's driven by an element of saying, you are entitled to this. Schemes of that nature must be backed by the second formula that South Korea did. South Korea said, if we are going to follow the entrepreneurship route, which venture capital is pointing our youth to, there must also be associated with that a mindset change. A change which says that, youth, today we love you, we want to assist you. But one, you'll never be a youth forever. As we give you this support today, quickly use this support to outlive the support we've given you and begin to quickly mature and go into the bigger financial sector. To what extent are we drumming that mindset change message to the person coming to pick the money?
We have a problem in terms of our education system. People do not learn so many hands-on skills. Now that means that even if you put a youth capital, venture capital here, the people who access it will not be able to match that thing because they don't have the ability to produce. So while it is important, and that's why you see failure, that's why in Tandikwa and all these things fail, because actually you don't have people who have got the know-how to actually be good producers, to be able to manage money. Because managing money is a skill. It's not something that you wake up one day and say, I'm poor, when they give me money, I become rich. No, there is a process that one has to go through.
We need to carry out some bit of education, some workshops, and then graduate at a level of now saying, okay, these people are ready for this money. Those who have either taken up trade, we have seen exactly that they have initiated, because there must be a move. You just cannot wish to be, to be a pilot when you have never gone into a cockpit of an aircraft. You would have needed to be trained preliminary, and then we know you are now on the move to be trained in this exercise.
The money we're talking about, the 25 billion, call it 100 billion, call it 200 billion, is insignificant compared to the amount of capital that's available within our households, our own community, and within the individual we call our own youth. By the time we begin to define capital in narrow terms and reduce it to the 25 billion, we have blinded our people to the abundant capital available in form of idle land, idle labor, idle business opportunities that do not even need a shilling. You blind our people to all those things and they begin to look for the 25 billion. If you got your 25 billion and went equitable and said there are 2 million youth who want capital, and we divided the 25 billion against the 2 million, it's just 12,500. Meaningless.
And solemnly affirm that I will give faithful service.
A key liability to Uganda's economic growth is public administration. In 1986, when NRM took power, Uganda had 33 districts, which increased to 81 districts by 2008, then to 112 by 2011. Currently, the number is at 117 districts. This blinding speed at which new districts are created ahead of every election for particular political ends has created mixed reactions in the public and political spheres, as a lot of taxpayers' money goes into the public administration of these districts.
This cry of creating more public expenditure, what is it called? Districts. Yeah, that's one of them. If you ask me, we have a headache of these expenditures. More MPs, more what, they are yielding for all these things. These things don't come from, actually, civil servants, they come from the politicians.
Would want to see legitimate demand, not genuine, not people eating grants and you're giving districts. Because also remember that the districts that we have right now, there are very many, and government has also still failed to adequately provide for them. And the more districts you have, the more members of parliament that you're going to have. And more and more monies are spent. And then let's remember that when you have more districts, you're creating more RDCs, GISOs, and if you look at the amount of money that government has to spend on all those monies can be used in other productive sectors.
You know what? Public expenditure is one thing. You want to ask yourself, where is it coming from? You can only wear garments up to the level you can manage to buy them. Who tells you that we should not be giving our children the best education possible? Where there should be in a classroom 40 pupils per teacher. Today we have got about 70, 80. Should have been better than that. Why shouldn't we be doing all those kind of good things? I think the good intentions must be benchmarked with our ability to deliver those things, but deliver them independently and sustainably. Do you want a president who is daily on a plane to go and beg for the next salary payment in Ireland, in Norway? Then he gets that payment done. Then the next plane is taking is to Canada. Oh, my people, the salary again is falling due. I'm here again to ask for another salary check. So to me, I think public expenditure must come from a very dependable, sustainable source.
And when you are spending more on public administration, then you have less now left for social service sector.
Although there are significant leaps made in economic growth, Uganda still faces challenges. Corruption is the most pressing challenge in Uganda today. Uganda boasts of high percentages of economic growth, but this growth is almost a facade for many people because it's non-inclusive.
Increasing private consumption, including payment of pensioners, because this is the grassroots-based demand. These are the people who will demand maize, plastics, local things that, remember, trigger the economic growth. You want to use public expenditure partly to stimulate public demand, but more so targeting provision of basics to allow the private sector generate things that meet the other demand we talked about. But you also want to specifically target some vulnerable communities. And I'm talking about pensioners here specifically. You're also talking about northern Uganda reconstruction at that time and still at this point. That begins to give you the concept of where these programs came from. They were for a purpose, a bigger economic purpose, but also targeting certain individuals.
If you look at the transport infrastructure, by the time we did the NDP, only 4% of the roads were functional. About 25% of our railways functional, but also with high limited functionality. There's limited irrigation across the country. When you look at the electricity consumption per capita is about 75 kilowatt-hour per capita compared to countries that are over 8,000 kilowatt-hour per capita. So there is limited functionality of the infrastructure, and I think it's one of the challenges. Over the next 30 years, we need to invest a lot in infrastructure to improve it and have modern infrastructure that can allow the country to be competitive.
Public investment is only 5%. And these two have to support each other.
An adequate supply of production, critical production inputs, and we specifically looked at the basic inputs in agriculture. For example, fertilizer. People don't have fertilizer as far as, so it limits the production. The steel, we looked at the steel, the iron ore industry. Steel is one metal that is used in construction, so you can't develop infrastructure when steel is very high. Otherwise, the cost of infrastructure becomes very high. So the issue of critical inputs to production is something that we thought we should unlock in the first 5 years of the National Development Plan.
However, recently, growth has slowed under the weight of shocks, both internal and external. On the external front, we all know about the slowdown in global trade, the euro crisis, et al. On the domestic front, we have recognized that we have now picked most of what you'd call the low-hanging fruit that was occasioned by the return of peace and stability. We must now climb harder and faster, higher up the tree of growth in order to ensure what we call development, which is sustainable and inclusive growth.
Any country that develops needs to have a high level of science and innovation, a high level of engineers in practice, but also the modern technology. The challenge we have now is that the technology we are lagging behind. If you compare us with the Americans, you find we are lagging behind nearly a century or so. So we need to step up, but most importantly by investing in the science sector, having a science kind of an innovation system that supports science, that involves the academia, the private sector, but also government, but also having a number of scientists that are sufficient to spark economic growth within the country. The number of scientists, the number of medical doctors, the number of engineers must be stepped up, the number of technicians, such that we have a sizable number that can develop the economy.
The strategy should therefore be based on initiatives aimed at intelligent, sustainable and inclusive growth in Uganda. This will enable a level of employment, productivity and social cohesion to increase.
The need to concentrate our limited resources on removing those key constraints that inhibit the private sector, our major partner, which accounts for 80% of GDP, from recognizing their own full potential. The second one is that growth, as I mentioned earlier, must be more diversified. When it comes to exports, we must not look at just the traditional exports. We must deliberately foster the new emphasis of exporting food staples to the region. This will take care of the still weak external situation that is still existing in most of our traditional export partners.
We're going in for a short break, but when we return, does Uganda need development aid from donors for its economy to grow? Donors fund up to 25% of Uganda's annual budget. But after the recent scandal in the office of the Prime Minister, this development aid was cut. And this begs one big question. Does Uganda need this donor aid?
We can never underestimate the impact of the actions taken by our long-term partners. But again, I think it was also a message for us to reckon with, because I would hate to say this, but the reality is this, that sometimes you get so used to the external support, the soft landing, so much that you actually do not imagine there will be a moment when it must get off. It is ridiculous as a country for us to have year in, year out, search for money for mosquito nets, search for money to feed our children at school, search for money to give our children stationery. Ridiculous.
Sometimes the aid that we get may not be the aid that we need. And that is a problem, because I could give you money for workshops when you need money for roads. Now, yes, I've given you money and I'm in solidarity, but that doesn't mean that you then produce more. The thing about aid is that aid can only work in a situation where you have a certain level of economic activity that allows for aid to actually flourish.
Get a development partner to work on your railway, to work on your airports, to work on your research facilities, not to give you food on the table when the rain is abundant. Not to come and give you mosquito nets when a mosquito net is an equivalent of a local chicken in Teso. When do we get out of this confusion? They are built as hospital facilities up to the deepest parts of the country. And we're again saying now they are not drugs. In this country, the only time we talk about value chains is when you are talking about a certain donor to come and work on it. Our concentration is budget allocation. We don't have enough money for doctors. We don't have enough money for scientists. We don't have enough money for this and the other. Correct. And whereas we can give you a lifeline today, where is your ultimate strategy to address those issues on your own? It's ridiculous, I will say it again, for any nation to be indebted on a platform of consumption. And I treat giving children lunch as consumption. I treat giving children stationery as consumption. I treat salaries as consumption. This medical bills, that's consumption for treatment. We should, as a nation, quickly be able to look after that.
Ghana was the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to gain political independence from the British in 1957. From 1966 to 1981, the country underwent continuous periods of political instability, just like Uganda. However, Ghana pulled herself out of the gulf of civil war and catastrophe to become sub-Sahara's leader of economic growth and development. Ghana is endowed with abundant natural resources like the large deposits of gold, diamond, bauxite, manganese, but what has strengthened Ghana's economy has been her political stability and sound governance system, good management, a competitive business environment, and sustained reductions in poverty levels. Agriculture accounts for roughly 1/4 of GDP and employs more than half of the workforce, mainly small landholders. The services sector accounts for 50% of GDP. Gold and cocoa production are major sources of foreign exchange. Oil production in Ghana's offshore Jubilee field began in mid-December of 2010 and is expected to further boost Ghana's economic growth. In 2009, Ghana signed a 3-year poverty reduction and growth facility with the International Monetary Fund to improve macroeconomic stability, private sector competitiveness, human resource development, and good governance and civic responsibility. Sound macroeconomic management, along with higher prices for oil, gold, and cocoa, helped sustain high GDP growth for Ghana. Ghana is a shining star for Africa.
Uganda, over the last 25 or so years, we moved our exports from 1 billion to 5 billion. Looks big. 600% looks big. The economy has grown. But until you look to others who have been able to leapfrog far beyond that, you can easily become complacent. We should be losing sleep. We should be asking deep and searching questions and saying, how come South Korea is 200 times better than us? And South Korea is good enough to offer the agenda for transformation. They said they only did 2 things. They said, 1, entrepreneurship. Let everybody begin to appreciate hard work. So South Korea simply said that let's define entrepreneurship and walk the route of entrepreneurship in practical terms. An entrepreneur can only be an entrepreneur if you take action to start, if you continue taking actions to continue expanding what you've done, and using available resources. Now, if you use your available resources so well, like South Korea said, you now begin to attract other resources to join you.
The aim of this program, Turning Around Uganda, is to figure out alternative policy or reforms that Uganda must undertake if she's to change the tide and foster development for the country in the years to come.
We are looking at investing heavily in infrastructure, especially the transport infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, and the ICT infrastructure. We are proposing alternative ways of doing infrastructure. One of them is PPPs, or public-private partnerships. And we are proposing at 2 levels. The first level is where government comes in and puts the money on the table, and the private sector puts money on the table, and then it is implemented as a joint project. But alternatively, we are looking at innovative ways like infrastructure fund, whereby a fund is set up where the infrastructure is developed purely by private sector, and government comes in with very limited stake, allowing for competitive infrastructure. In the infrastructure sector, there is infrastructure that is really highly economically viable, especially the energy infrastructure is economically viable, water infrastructure is economically viable, and also ICT infrastructure. So if you invest in money in that kind of infrastructure, you are likely to get the returns over a defined period. And as such, the private sector, if provided with a conducive atmosphere, they will be willing to invest in that kind of infrastructure.
I think we need to look at the old school of economics, which cited that for any productivity of a given economy, and hence its ability to absorb labor that it generates, the basics of capital, labor, land, technology, and then fifthly, entrepreneurship must all be functional. Now, To get all this functional, it's not just about a macroeconomic agenda where you talk about electricity, where you talk about good roads, where you talk about security. It comes to getting the agenda of microeconomics, where households, individuals, and communities begin to take advantage of the macroeconomic environment and begin to account for their time, for the energy, for their talent. So to a great extent, we need to go back and get the Ugandan to wake up and become productive. And that is not something that you can talk about in terms of a donor, in terms of President Museveni. It's about all of us rising up and just saying, what can we do to awaken the ordinary Ugandan to realize that all around him are opportunities that we've not tapped into.
Government should do its business like the way private sector does its business, such that you reduce the bureaucracy, the red tape within government. You shorten the way things are done. But that requires changing so many laws that we have. One of them I will tell you is the PPDA law. The PPDA law, if you go back to its principles cannot really support implementation of private sector approach within government. That law is really a challenge. If you go back to the principles of that law, the principles of that law actually are not in tandem with the business approach or what the private sector can do. I can give examples of this. You find you are limited. If you put up an advert of international nature, you need, I think, 42 days. To wait for 42, those are 2 months down the road. So you find that the minimum amount of time you can take for any procurement starts from 6 months, stretching to 2 years. And that's not a business approach if you are giving me a yearly budget. Because if you give me a yearly budget, my procurement should be either monthly or within the first 2 months, such that I can have more time to implement. And I think if the procurement law is not changed, I don't see us implementing infrastructure faster. I don't see us attaining the targets that we have stated in the vision or in the National Development Plan.
Investment in strategic areas, both as government or encouraging private sector to go there, or both government and private sector moving in tandem, so that we develop key strategic areas. And I've mentioned oil and gas, iron ore, phosphate industries. Those will be turnaround for this country.
What Uganda needs is specific interventions by the state, for example, in supporting the growth of value-added exports. I would prefer to see the government of Uganda support industries that are setting up to turn our raw materials into finished products to enter Western markets or global markets. We need to strengthen bilateral and multilateral relations with this region, because the greatest value of earnings we can get from our exports is largely through our neighbors. Look at companies like Mokwana and Biduk and others. Uganda breweries, their largest export destinations are South Sudan, Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, Northern Tanzania, and Western Kenya. So we need to tap into those markets.
When Southern Sudan fell in trouble with its income, our exports failed. So the growth, economic growth in the region is key to our growth of our exports and key to our economic growth sustainability.
Heavy investment in energy. We need electricity, and we need electricity.
You can build so many karumas, you won't renew the growth. You've got to bring back domestic demand to begin with.
We have to raise public investment, and the ratio of investment, public investment must rise from about 5%, which it is now, towards 10%. The real exchange rate needs to be depreciated, and nominal needs to be depreciated to make the exchange rate conducive for the export sector. That's one important policy that needs to be done.
Uganda is an agroeconomy, and the fact that it's growing much slower than it should be means that there is a lot more that can be done in order to tap that potential and make sure that it adds to the growth that has been happening.
We need to invest more in quality education and human resource, and I think this is important we have been doing what we call extensive UPE, but I think time has come for us to start also focusing on quality education and education that matter to improve our those areas.
This time, we want to make sure that the growth, as I mentioned earlier, is both inclusive, that is, leaves no sector of the population behind, and sustainable. That is something that will propel further growth. And this is very important to remember in view of our oncoming status as an oil-producing country.
The crisis on the economy growing lower than this is that I think this focuses our head what should be done, and it's good for the long-term growth. And therefore, the answer is what should be done? Reform, 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 implement in all areas of the economy.
And that's all we have time for on this episode of Turning Around Uganda, the Alternative Policy Series. We want to thank you, our dear viewers, for watching, the contributors and those that have participated in the panel and the debate discussions.